Thank you. And welcome to all of you again, and welcome Tania. So Tania Singer is a woman who has accomplished a lot in your career, and you are not only really, really smart, but you also come with great heart and great passion and much goodness. And we're honored to have Tania as a member of the Mind and Life Board. She's been a member of the board and a member of the Mind and Life community for a very long time. You probably grew up with the Mind and Life community.
Yeah, indirectly, yes.
Yes.
So, yeah.
And you also serve on the Mind and Life Europe board
Yeah.
as well. So I have her formal bio, so I don't miss some things here. And this is a very, very short synopsis because her real CV is multiple dozens of pages. So Tania comes to us from Germany, and she is a director, has been a managing director at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, and you're in the Department of Human, Cognitive, and Brain Sciences. And before that, you were the inaugural chair of Social Neuroscience and Neuroeconomics and co-director of the Laboratory for Social and Neural Systems Research at the University of Zurich. And your work, you are really renowned for your work in empathy and compassion. If we had to boil down what Tania studies, it's empathy and compassion, and with an emphasis on what happens in the brain and the body. And your work is as a social neuroscientist. And you investigate the psychological and neuroscientific effects of compassion and mental training on the brain, the mind, health, cooperation. And you've just completed this mega study called the Resource Study that you're putting out a lot of very important papers on right now, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And in this study, and others, you look at how biology and psychology can also inform new models of working together, and maybe even from an economics perspective, how this work can inform how we can collaborate and work together. And the book, Caring Economics, is a Mind and Life book. It's based on a Mind and Life dialogue. And the full title of that book is Caring Economics, Conversations on Altruism and Compassion Between Scientists, Economists, and the Dalai Lama. So we're honored to have you here in Charlottesville. Thank you for taking the time to be here with us and to visit our community.
It's great to be here.
Yeah. So I want to begin, Tania. So you are called a social neuroscientist. Tell us what a social neuroscientist is.
Yeah, so that is kind of a field which was born around 2000, around this millennium, and the idea was like in the beginning of human neuroscience with the scanner and the brain imaging techniques, people had focused on measuring single things like motor or vision or memory or language, speech, But they had always encountered the human brain as being isolated from a social reality. So it was like speaking and memorizing and viewing and tasting. But it wasn't be social. It wasn't be about understanding others and communicating, cooperating, and so on. Mm-hmm. And partly that was also because the machines we use are super isolated. I mean, you're like lying. I don't know how many of you have lied in these kind of brain imaging scanner. It's very loud and you're isolated. It's all but social. And so I think that was partly a reason why people didn't dare to kind of really, measure the social brain. And so it needed some time to people develop social neuroscience and say, look, let's go one step further and not only investigate how a single brain works, but how brains work in interaction and how do we make sense of what other people's feeling, how do I understand what you're thinking, what you're wanting, your beliefs, everything which seems to be so important in human interaction. wasn't investigated. And so this was the birth of social neuroscience. So, and social neuroscience, I think it's important to say it's not just brain, even though the word neuroscience in it. It's a very interdisciplinary field, and so there are an chronologist, sociologist, philosopher, economist working there. My lab is really super interdisciplinary, and I think they all take a different perspective on how to kind of get at these questions. So it's a funny field.
It's wonderful.
Young and fresh.
So how did you get into it? What interested you?
To go into that? I mean, I was a classical psychologist beforehand, doing my PhD in Berlin on learning, and like what we called cognitive psychology. So it was all about memory and language and so on. And I think I got a bit bored about that because I was like, this is not really capturing who we are. And I think also because I'm a monozygotic twin, I was born with a twin. Mm-hmm. I was born in this kind of interconnected reality with having a twin, already in the womb to play with and to interact. And so I guess I found I was a bit like, this is so artificial to think that we are individual bubbles, thinking and speaking without this social reality we are constantly in. And so I wanted to both learn about the brain more, because I was just in behavioral psychology, and I wanted to include the social reality. So I went to London, because at that time the field of social neuroscience wasn't really born yet officially, but there was one mentor. He became my mentor. He's called Chris Friss, and he was investigating, I think at that time really the only one in the world, higher function like theory of mind. So he was...
Say what theory of mind is.
So theory of mind is like cognitive perspective taking. So it's not about feeling and emotions, but it's about putting yourself into the cognitive shoes of another person, What is this other person believing? What is it holding for beliefs? It's cognitive perspective taking. So, and he was investigating that with a new technique like the imaging came just, it only came in the 90s, so it's very late in history in a way. And I was fascinated, so I kind of asked him whether I could become postdoc, and he said, it's a bit crazy because you are not a neuroscientist yet. I mean, I was more in psychology, behavior, and so on. But he took me on board, so then I developed basically the first empathy study ever in London. And we were the first to ever put two people in a scanner environment and ask, the question, if I'm scanned and I get, kind of nociceptive pain, what is actually happening in my brain if I see my partner sitting next to the scanner also getting pain, but I'm not feeling anything? I just know, now my partner is getting these kind of little painful stimuli. What's happening, which we call empathy, is like feeling with the pain of another. And, you might think it's normal because we feel empathy, no? We feel if someone is suffering, we can feel it, so somewhere it needs to be in the brain somewhere. But at that time, everyone was saying, you are crazy, this will be an empty brain. In the trials where it's the other, you don't even get something to your body, there is nothing coming into your body. So why would you see something, you couldn't measure something. And I was like, yeah, but introspectively, you feel, no, if someone is suffering and you like him, you also suffer partly. So at some point, the brain needs to, so we did this experiment, and the brain was like lighting up like fire, there was a lot of response to
lighting up in a way as if the person who wasn't getting the painful stimuli was experiencing
exactly. So it's almost like I reactivate the circuitry in my brain which processes my own pain if I really get pain. If I know my partner is in pain or I see someone in pain, not as badly than if I'm in pain and not the whole network, but big parts of it. And so that was kind of the first evidence that we are in this kind of emotional resonance all the time with people, even like milliseconds, and if you would ask people, they would not necessarily consciously know that they're now having these responses in the brain. You don't feel it, your brain. So it was interesting to see it, there is this response in everyone.
That was revolutionary.
Yeah, that
and
time
it
was very, I know that people were like, what?
And what year was that?
2004 the science paper came out. So the results is usually a year before, so 2003 or so. And then it was accepted immediately in Science, and it was really strange because Science is it's the highest journal which exists in our world. And usually people who just enter the field wouldn't go. So my PIs were very much astonished. They were like, oh my God, you see really a response.
Yeah.
And it went through. So that was the beginning, in a way, of the whole empathy research.
Yeah. So that was the beginning of your work. And now let's fast forward to the resource project, which is this huge study, this really amazing study, and you've published 25 papers on it to date, and could probably publish another 25 if you had another 25 years to do it, and more time and money to do it, but energy. But maybe you could just describe a bit about what the resource project is, and in very simple non-scientific terms.
Because it's a very complex project, so it's always easy to talk about it very complex.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's like it's a 9-month mental training program which uses, contemplative practice, like meditation practice from the East, but also some of the West. So it's a kind of reunion of psychological exercises to train your mind and Eastern contemplative. And then it is a program which is completely secularized. So, people who are religious can do it, people who are Buddhist, but also people who are atheists or scientists. So it's really accessible to everyone. And what we have followed 300 people over a year with 90 different measures, from brain to body, behavior, interviews, name them, hormones, immune markers, and followed them every 3 months while they were going through different modules of mental training. So in the first 3 months, they would do attention-based mindfulness training. In the second 3 months, they would do heart-opening compassion-based training. And in the last 3 months, they would do more like this cognitive perspective-taking, this kind of bird's-eye view on your mind, on self, and on other people's beliefs. So, and that allowed us to compare we wanted to move beyond this kind of a bit, let's say, simplistic view which now exists in the press sometimes, where everyone speaks about mindfulness as one thing, or like meditation as one thing. And it's a bit like in sport, you wouldn't think that you go into a gym, and when you do your muscles on the back every day, 3 months, you wouldn't expect your toe muscles to get bigger. And in a way, the whole mindfulness discourse is a bit like this is a monolithic thing, like, sport. But in sport, you would also ask, are you riding, or are you rowing, or are you, doing chess playing, or what are you doing? And then depending on what you do, you have different expectation of your body changing. So in a way, it's the same with the mind. It's a very complex and not a unitary thing. So you can have different exercises training different things, cultivating different things. And this is what we did. So we compared what is the effect of compassion training on the mind and on the brain and cortisol and stress. And
so what were the most surprising findings?
So obviously, as you said, there are many, many papers, and so each paper in itself.
But if you had to just sort of...
But if I would say, I think perhaps not surprising, but still an important message, is that it really, really matters what you train. So we have not a single measure which is not showing differential effects. So, like meaning, for example, if you look at pure altruistic cooperation behavior, as we measured this with economic game theoretical paradigm in the lab, we see that only after the compassion-based socio-emotional module, you really get an increase in altruism. And for example, attention-based mindfulness, which a lot of apps do right now, like breathing and body scan, is not doing a thing. For compassion and altruism. So you really need these kind of explicit training of the heart and of really like connecting to another person, like really opening yourself, not just me in my bubble, getting calmer, breathing and getting more attentive, but you you need to have exercises which bring the other person into your sphere, and where you do these intersubjective and connected exercises. And only then, for example, you also get social stress down. So on the cortisol level, when you know what social stress is a bit different than the typical stress, we have from our ancestor. So it's not because we are stressed because we don't have food or we are cold or so. Social stress is the fear of being evaluated, not being good enough, not being fast enough, comparing each other, uncertainty. And that's the stress which is the most prevalent in the Western society.
And I'm thinking with children and
schools,
too, right?
And schools,
and
like
the internet.
The pressure of achieving and being not good enough and so on. So in a way, the social stress is a very prominent problem of our Western society. And so we really looked at this stress, and not only whether you feel subjectively stressed, like through questionnaire, do you feel less stressed? But we really looked at the HPH axis product cortisol. And if you measure the hormone, you really see that 3 months of this kind of more attention-based, basic mindfulness exercise don't change your response to social stress. You really need to engage into this compassion-based or perspective-taking-based intersubjective social practices, where you learn every day, how to immunize you from fearing judgment of the others. So we do practices where you connect 10 minutes with everyone, with people from your group. So if you were participants, you would have one practice where every day, 10 minutes, you would connect with another person of your group, and every week with a new one. And you would do this kind of meditation together. One would just listen and the other would...
On video, right?
No, they do it on the phone.
On the phone, okay.
They have an app. And so, in a way, you experience every day, in the middle of your day, someone empathically listening to you without interrupting, without judging. And then you are, reflecting on how stress works on your body and things like that. Depends on which diet. And then you switch role. So every day you have the experience, the other person is just a human being like me. They are also stressed. They also feel thankfulness. They are all just human beings, even though I thought he's arrogant, he's actually not. So you kind of start to feel this kind of, we are just a shared human race, And so I think this is what brings the fear of social evaluation down. And so when they go into these social stress tests, they're just less stressed. They're just less, another human being,
That's wonderful.
Why
that's
would I have, and that's the interconnected nature, and that's really social neuroscience. It's basically getting the message home, we are not isolated beings. We are intrinsically connected and interdependent and social. So, yeah. So that is one, and we have a lot of these findings, but that is kind of, I think, important for the message that nowadays mindfulness is becoming sometimes a bit reductionist. People don't see the whole ethical sphere around it. And so these findings speak, to the complexity of practices and phenomena.
That's wonderful. So one final question that I have. So based on the findings from the resource project that you have to date, how do you think those findings can be applied and translated into the real world?
So, really, I'm a scientist at the moment, and so, of course, I'm a scientist doing data and so on, but the intervention protocol we developed is an intervention protocol. It's there. It's a science-based intervention. So a lot of people knock on our door, like teachers, business people, healthcare system, because we also developed exercise how to recognize, how to switch from empathy to compassion, and how to avoid burnout, and how to increase resilience through moving from an empathic distress response into compassion. That's another topic. And so there are many exercises which could really benefit healthcare system, and avoid nurses to burn out like flies, which is happening right now. Certainly in Germany and in Europe, we have a lot of burnout in teachers. They're completely overwhelmed. Kids, have very early depression because they are under too much pressure and aggression. And so we have huge amount of problems to face. So the qualities which are cultivated in this program are universal. You know, it's like how to better regulate your stress, how to be more self-compassion with yourself, how to be more cooperative, less bullying, you know. So there are lots of applications, but having said that, we can't just put this protocol, like the complex 6 months, into a nursing school where they have 10 minutes a day, you know. Mm-hmm. So the next step would be to adapt this program to the different environments with the different needs. A business person needs something else than, you know, a teacher in school, and then a nurse would need another. So we will need to kind of take that and decompose and, you know, adapt it to this needs. And I think that's, from what I can feel also in America, I've been around, you know, seeing a lot of Compassion Mindfulness Center now. I think we are all at the same stage of questioning, how can we bring now the science-based curriculum, which there are many of them now, into the real world and adapt it in a meaningful way to the people they need it, you know.
Yeah, wonderful.
So that's future.
Awesome. That's really great. Thank you. So I will open it up for questions, comments. Stephen.
I guess what interests me, like coming off of Susan's last question, it's easy to imagine interventions where, let's say, people approach you who are students, teachers, nurses, caregivers, and so on, who are, in fact, living within the context of a large society that has, where someone has deliberately turned up the dial of stress and the dial of non-empathy to an extraordinary degree. You know, one symptom of which is the rise of Nazism in the United States and in Europe and in other places. And, you know, we have a sense, I mean, obviously the kinds of studies that you're doing have not yet had a chance to be longitudinal. But
They are longitudinal.
If they were back to the 1970s, maybe, that we would find that we're in a very different, that our societies are in a very, very different place now.
Yes.
And that somehow, you know, providing training for individuals might be very helpful, but somehow it's like putting Band-Aids on a truly enormous problem that's systemic and that is institutional throughout our society.
Yeah.
And how might we approach that? I mean, I'm not expecting you to have a magical answer.
But we actually talked about it the whole day, and you know, my whole thinking in the last time is all about that. So I think me as a psychologist and, you know, being kind of specialist in the individual change business, you know, I know all about, you know, psychology, how you individually change. These programs are based on individuals or diets, you know, it's 2 people. And then, you know, I work also since 10 years, I'm in dialogue and also cooperate on models with economists, behavioral economists, macroeconomists. And they talk all about institutional design, system, you know, like laws. And so there are these 2 worlds, like, you know, the one, they think social change can only happen through turning the screw on law and on institutions, and we thinking, you know, as psychologists, you have to be the change you want to see in the world, you know, like individually. And I think the answer is neither in the one pole nor in the other, but they need to work together. And I think that didn't happen. So I was, for example, stunned over years now to debate with macroeconomists, especially the macroeconomists, because they have the power. The micro-behavioral economists, they're great, but they are not really, you know, like consulting the government. So, and the macroeconomists, they still have a view of human nature which is awfully old, you know, like Homo economicus and so on. I mean, it's completely nuts if you're a psychologist to see the axiomatic of it. But they have the power. Now the question is, how can we bring these worlds together? They never speak to psychologists, or very, very seldomly. The behavioral economists do, and then they become Nobel Prize because they call that a paradox or anomaly, which for psychologists is just like, no, your theory is an anomaly, and this is why you create paradox if you measure a real human, you know. So I think we need to talk, and we also talked, you know, I think the best vision would be to create an institute where a school would come, knock on the door, like, you know, they knock on my door, and then it wouldn't be only me as an individual change expert, but it would be people as experts on systemic change and on governmental structures working together to transform, for example, this school from the top to the bottom in a congruent way. So you would have to speak from the CEO or like the director of the school, you know, to adapt programs like that for kids and the teacher, and you need a real systemic concept for that. And to my knowledge, it didn't happen yet. You know, there are institutes which do the system consulting, and then there are, you know, all the psychologists, therapists of this world, and, you know, scientists, and they are expert in the individual change. And as long I think that these worlds do not come together in a congruent and meaningful way, I think it will be hard to really shift societal change in a meaningful, sustainable manner. So I completely agree, and I just think we need to do it because it's not. I mean, it's happening more and more, but I don't think in enough concertation. You know, like. But perhaps you have another, you know, view on that. I'm not a politician, economist, so it's, you know.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you knew about there is a prediction out there that in 2020, 50% of the humans will be depressed and anxious.
Mm-hmm.
So you're sort of up against an epidemic. And we were talking about, you know, how I agree with what you're saying, but how do you fight the epidemic?
So that's perhaps another big discussion point I think we had also today.
Well, first of all, do you agree with that?
Yeah.
We're growing in depression and anxiety.
Yeah, so that's a fact.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, for example, burnout, which is a kind of fashionable diagnosis, you know, oh, I have a burnout. When you say, oh, I have a burnout, it sounds like I have worked a lot, you know, and this is why I have a burnout. So in a way, it's societal acceptable. It's like I'm so hard worker that I couldn't do more, you know. But in psychological old terms, it's just a depression. It's a exhaustion depression. Burnout, there is no diagnosis in the official ICD-10 for burnout. It's a depression through exhaustion. So in a way, if you take that, the numbers of depression go up. Sometimes it's hidden under burnout, or, you know, like kind of. And also another thing, narcissism is growing in Western society. So I didn't understand whether you were saying Nazism or narcissism.
Well, they're interrelated.
So I'm talking now of narcissism, not
yeah.
like Nazi German thing. I'm half German, so, you know, I would not talk about it like that. But narcissism, like as a trait, is increasing. So there is studies, and they call it a narcissistic epidemic, because the questionnaire in the 70s, which were normed, you know, with American population in narcissism, is now like a whole standard deviation up for the whole population. It's not just some individuals. So it's the whole culture basically growing into narcissism is like exaggerated individualism. And that is creating anxiety, because everything is about the ego and is about a threat that you are not good enough, you know, that you, social stress.
But technology is feeding that, though.
And technology and
With
Facebook is feeding
and
it.
the
It's
cell-
like
and the-
great, good,
And
you
the
know,
selfie,
the cell phones
yeah,
and so on.
yeah.
And especially this kind of Facebook technology, which make you think that you are connected with the person, but you're not really connected. It's all about, I'm eating now my yogurt, I'm boarding the plane.
So socialization could be the cure for 50%.
I think we connecting people. So this is a little bit what we try to, in a meaningful way, not this narcissistic way like of social platforms, but for example, this dyadic experience of 10 minutes. This was amazing to see, given that you are disclosure, you are telling something about your own anxiety, you are showing vulnerability to another, and how that is feeling and how you can accept that to be a reality of you, not suppress it or, you know, always do, hey, I'm great, super, you know, but really like, you know, I'm anxious of that, I'm like, and so, and you have this other witness, and that, we did research, the people afterward feel more connected to other people again. not only to the people they did the diet with, but also generally to the world. They just, from week to week to week, before they connect to the next person, sometimes is a foreigner, someone they didn't know, they already say, I'm feeling more connected to the person I will be connected with. So there is something growing, like reconnecting to this kind of world, like a solidarity. And you know, I wouldn't talk so much about it if we wouldn't also know that experienced loneliness is one of the best predictors for a lot of diseases and mortality. And that's not objective
physical
loneliness,
diseases.
Physical diseases and mortality. So it is how much people experience whether they are lonely. So it is not objectively whether they have friends
No, it's
around
how
or
they feel.
how much Facebook friends they have. It's like how much do you feel lonely and connected. And that subjective soft measure is really very potent predictor of a lot of physical health markers and mortality. So if you can find a way to meaningfully reconnect people to the feeling of I am part of this nature, I'm part of this community, and I feel reconnected, whether, you know, and the diets do that, but a lot of other things do that too. And I think we need that, because I agree with you that people, you know, talk about climate change, and I absolutely think this is also a threat, and, you know, perhaps we might die before. But I think on a psychological level, this kind of increasing narcissism associated with anxiety, depression, it's all a cluster, is the biggest virus we are confronting right now. I think, and it's funny because people don't talk so openly about that. You know, the media are more talking about inequality gap or, you know, like palpable things, but they don't talk so much about a psychological epidemic. But I think
make this phone thing go global?
Huh?
Make this phone thing go global?
Yeah, so that's another discussion we had today. You know, we had in the resource project, we embedded it in a real community, so people would connect once a week with real people, and then they had the app where they would do that at home. And I'm always so a bit conservative to just do it app-based. You know, like people always want to have it and scale it big and do an app-only thing. But I think the real connection of real living people looking to the eyes at least some point in their experience is super important too. So I think my tendency, but I have no answer, no scientific answer whether, would be yes, we can have a global app, but I think there needs to be an initiation ritual which is happening local, where you do this dyadic interaction locally with people. You learn about the nature of contemplation and of real dialogue, you know, so that it doesn't become a chit-chat again and some kind of watery, you know, all stuff. So I guess we will need both. And I see that more and more with these online massive courses, you know, especially in America, that you have more and more this technology where you can have local hubs, like we would be a community doing certain practices as local, you know, tangible beings being in a room, but we would at the same time connect through technology with a global community at the same time. And a lot of people do that already. And that feels really, you know, a bit like the brain works. The brain is like, if you take the brain as a world, the brain has local hubs like vision, smell, memory, and these are like local networks of neurons which are very closely connected in talk, you know, like here. But then they have long-range connectivity, we call that, which would be a long-range connectivity to Berlin hub. So, you know, vision would talk to smell. And the brain works through both, through having vision being an expert hub together, and then talking to smell at the same time through long range. And the whole thing gives human beings, you know, or a functioning brain. So in a way, I see the world is a bit like that. You have like all this global world, but we also need local communities. And if the local community can work together, but being connected globally in the consciousness of a global brain, like of a global connection, then you have both aspects. You know, you feel responsible for the global community, but you also have still physical humanity.
Like the Mind and Life Institute. So we had a couple of hands up, and I know we're checking with time. Okay, so I would be great if we can have a couple of, and Sarah had a question too, so
Okay.
please go and then.
So finding this very interesting. My husband and I have been studying this kind of notion about individualism, narcissism, in regard to couples for the last 20 or 30 years. And out of that, we've developed an organization called Couples Coaching Couples, and within that, the couple has these dyadic conversations within themselves, and then they also have it with another couple, and then we have we call it a circle, but a group of couples that get together, and then it expands to a national group.
Oh, okay, so it's same idea.
Idea, and we have found that it really, we haven't tested it with the brain, but that it really has helped people to get out of their own individual narcissism or individuality and be able to be generous and have these kinds of connections. So I'm just wondering, have you ever done any studies with couples?
No.
Because the dyadic, opportunity.
There were couples in our resource project by chance, so they did the dyadic sometimes at home, but sometimes with others. But we didn't like systematically study only couples. They were just randomly some of them.
It
Yeah.
seems like it's such a natural place that we could
Start.
study this because the dyad is already there, and it's one of the major problems in couples is, being able to get beyond me, mine, and get into creating a couple as an entity.
A lot of participants told me, like more qualitatively, that they would now do diets with their couple, even though the husband was not necessarily in the project, but just like naturally they taught the partner and said, let's do an affect diet or let's do a perspective-taking diet, and that helped them to manage their conflicts better. And so,
That would be interesting to study the couples in that regard.
Yeah, great idea.
Great idea.
And Sarah, did you want to ask a question?
I have a comment. I have seen a lot of people with a lot of mental disorders. I think that we've all experienced it with people that are not making good decisions and harming others. And I've seen a lot of narcissistic disorder, borderline personality disorder, psychopaths, sociopaths. And the way their brains are set up, you don't even know if you can even get through to these people. It seems like there's a rise in that. Can you, in your studies, have you been able to, in your work, be able to actually make changes in people's brains that have mental disorders?
So like in my department, we study Asperger's syndrome, borderline narcissism. So, but we have not yet applied the training work onto psychopathology, because first what we did with this 9 months study, this was so much risk, there wasn't any study like that out there. We didn't want it to go in a 9-month study with borderline patients or depressed people without having a whole therapeutic stuff. We wanted to be ethical about that. So we screened the 300 people for not being any of these patient population. So they were relatively healthy. I'm saying relatively healthy because we all have neurosis, all trauma, we are all a bit nuts, no? So in a way that was our population, but we didn't have like borderliner. And I think that the program needs to be adapted for each of these. We have done a lot of brain research, but also behavioral research on the differential fingerprints between, for example, Asperger and psychopaths. They seem to have all social deficit. They look very different. So, for example, an Asperger, is the time over? An Asperger or autistic, they have theory of mind deficit, the cognitive root, but they not necessarily have any empathy deficit. If they're not alexithymic, they have.
Do you understand what you just said?
So it's like if you decompose the social brain, it's not all about. So if people say they have a lack of empathy, usually they mean some kind of gross term of empathy, like something about the other. But we, as social neuroscience, we know all these different roots. So empathy is relying on a different circuitry in the brain than compassion, theory of mind on another. And so we can see that, for example, psychopathy is super good in theory of mind, but they lack compassion. Asperger, they don't lack empathy if they don't have alexithymia, but they are lacking theory of mind. Narcissists have yet another complete different profile. And so even though they might all seem alike. They are not. They have very, very clear, like borderline is usually an emotion regulation problem, but it's not. They have super high empathy because they would depict immediately every social cue threatening their social attachment pattern. So depending on with whom you work, you would have to adapt the program totally different. So for example, an eye-to-eye diet with Asperger, no way. They hate looking into the eyes of the other, they would die. So you would only have to do it by phone, things like that. So
That would be interesting to see.
yeah, you can, you would need to really adapt. But there are, for example, the acceptance and commitment therapy, which is very much also kind of,
What kind?
That's a mindfulness-based
it's a
program.
mindfulness-based, compassion-based acceptance and commitment therapy. It's ACT. ACT. And that is has been developed for borderliner, for example, and they use it now in all kind of different psychopathology in adapted ways, and it works apparently super well. There is not like such a research. I mean, a research project. You have to imagine it's 12 years of preparation, 3 years of just scanning, and another 10 years just to publish. So you can't basically do this study like, oh, let's do them with borderline and let's do with businessmen. So, it's a kind of lifelong work. So you need to be mindful about what you want to study. But, I think this will also, and there is much more plasticity than you think. You can do things. We have been raised in our generation with this idea with 25 your brain shrinks and nothing can be done anymore. That's not true. Our data show, our average age was 43 up to 55. Then we stopped because of the brain scans, not because we don't think that people of more than 55 can learn. And we find huge amount of structural plasticity. The brain structurally grow. Gray matter increases after mental training like we did.
And it doesn't matter what age.
And
So
it's not
is
age.
there, do you think that there's an age ceiling that would,
I mean, people always said 25 is over, and then, they discovered.
what do you think now? What do you?
I think, there's, the more you age, the individual difference gets bigger, so variation gets bigger. There are people who are demented. They will not learn a thing.
We had Jim Austin here.
Yes, and then there are
he's
people,
92.
exactly, like, Eric Kandel, where you're like, here's a Bonnie. I mean, he would certainly learn and have plasticity. He is so much, so there is a huge variability which during, 20 and 50 is less expressed. Yeah, so in older age, it kind of goes a bit more apart. But, I think really lifelong learning, and the brain is plastic, not as a child anymore, but, and we have evidence now. This is the last paper which came out in Science Advance about these practice modules inducing brain plasticity, so hardware change in an adult brain.
Fascinating. Heather, did you have a comment or anything? I saw
Well,
your hand.
just quickly, were the conversations scripted, and what did they talk about in the dyads?
So I can't short. It's super scripted dialogue, and depending on in which module you are, you have different diets.
Is it available for people to see?
No, I mean, on the paper you can see how it works and so, but we don't have a manual of doing that. And the reason why is because the perspective diet needs 3-day introduction. So to do the inner part work, for example, and to work out these parts so that then you can train it, you need an introduction. And so we have not worked out how short we can do this introduction so that people know what is an inner part. You can't just jump into that. The affect diets is much easier, and it's all very scripted. So these, they're like meditation, like dong, 2.5 minutes, dong. So, and people are not chit-chatting. So one is just listening, and that is very, very impressive too. The first time they do this diet, and the one person listening is really told, don't even nod your head or do this social kind of stuff. Just be there, present and listen, and not be in the space of the other. Don't do, I know that, because then you are already kind of getting the attention of the other. So
Making it your story instead of
it's your
theirs.
story instead of that. What we usually do, like someone is saying, we prepare already, I'm like, yeah, I know that. And someone, yes, it's like me when I had my, and then off it goes, and then the other is preparing, And the diet is really about, no, you are not allowed to comment the other. And so you really need to listen. And then a lot of people at the first introduction of the diets in the retreat started crying. And we were like, you know, what's happening here? Is this like the question? And they were all saying, you know, it made me realize I have not listened to anybody over years. I just didn't listen. You know, and it's like super touched, like, oh, that's listening? You know, without an intention to go, you know, and so that's very, very powerful as an experience, you know, and that's just the listener. Now the talker is experiencing about itself, about like how to experience stress, what is it doing to you, thankfulness, gratitude, depending on the question. Who am I? You know, how do I construct my reality every day, depending on, yeah, and so it's short and very, very powerful, I find. You know, so, but there are certainly many ways, you know, to kind of, but this, I think the nature of this true dialogue, of this really seeing the other, that's the thing.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. So Tania, thank you not only for being here, but thank you for all of the wonderful work that you've done and what you're continuing to do.
And thank you
deep
all
gratitude.
Having that here. You're like holding a precious space. And it's the first time I'm in Charlottesville, but I'm very impressed by this little town. There is amazing work going on.
Come back.
And my life is doing amazing work. And so, yeah, I'm coming back.
Thank you.
Now I know the way.